Right, of course, we're looking at the intervertebral disc here. You should know that the vertebral bodies are minimally innervated, but let's maybe get this ball rolling. What would the neural fibers extending into the vertebral bone be doing? Do you think? What is their function? I guess is what I'm asking. Why would there be neural processes going into the vertebral bone? Are they there? For example, why do you have a giant nerve in the middle of your tooth? There you go. You're thinking like me. Yeah, it's just there to create misery and suffering. I can't think of any other reason. Of course I can. But the point is, you might liken that to this context. What is the function of those?
Pressure, compression.
So how do you mean? Again, the vertebral body now, not the disc, but the body. All right, so you're arguing that those things are probably responding. I guess what you're arguing is that they're sensory. That's your assumption, right? Could be, of course, if the vertebral body. I don't know that that's ever been shown, but of course, I guess my point is if they're sensory, isn't it almost too late? If the body is damaged, what are you going to do? I mean, yeah.
Do they have any proprioceptive properties, or is that more muscle?
I'm not aware of that. Again, I think that's what George was suggesting, and I just haven't seen much in the literature to suggest that. I guess what I was asking you, can there be any other function? You sort of went right where I was pointing you to. But can you think of any other function of neural fibers in bone in general? Could be. I think I wouldn't. But what type of fibers would, if that's what they were doing, how would you classify such fibers? Would it be somatic? What do most autonomic fibers do for you? Yeah, and so I just want you to understand, just because you have neural processes in bone doesn't mean they're sensory. They could be regulating blood flow. They could be performing all sorts of other functions. I want you to think of, so whether or not bone significantly contributes to the sensation of pain, as it does in some regions of the body. For example, there's no question that when a bone breaks or there's severe shear stress, there's pain associated with that. However, it's not necessarily the case that that's the primary function of the very limited innervation of the vertebra. All right. That notwithstanding, let's turn our attention to the intervertebral disc, because here you very clearly see, by the way, there isn't much innervation here. No one argues that there's any significant innervation in the nucleus pulposus. But we can clearly see equatorial branches proceeding into the annulus fibrosus. So there's our source of pain. Anybody see anything in that picture that might lead you to a different conclusion? Any reason that you might conclude that these have nothing to do with pain? What?
Are they branches of the gray ramus cons, and that's like sympathetic?
Yeah. So before we just make the assumption that these fibers are responsible for sensations of pain, you need to appreciate that virtually all of the fibers extending into the annulus are autonomic, are almost entirely sympathetic. So does that rule out the possibility that they would be contributing to pain sensation? I invite you to look at the literature on this. Do you remember our discussion of visceral afferents? These are called spinal afferents. And what most of this research shows is you have these bizarre neurons, some of which seem to have a sensory function in the same way that visceral afferents have a sensory function, and that most of them follow traditional sympathetic pathways. That is to say, as we talked about with synapses in the paravertebral ganglia. But here's one thing that I think is important that you need to add to your fund of knowledge on the topic, because we're very fuzzy about this. I think it's very important, is that with progressive deterioration of the intervertebral disc, what do you think happens to the density of neural fibers?
Goes down.
Bartek says it goes down. Would you believe it actually increases dramatically? Goes up, yeah. And it takes me back to my question about why do you have a giant nerve in the middle of your tooth? What would be the purpose of that? Just to intensify your agony, as far as I can tell. No, I'm joking, of course. I don't know that we understand why that happens, but it's very clear histologically that with progressive deterioration of the intervertebral discs, the profusion, the density of neural fibers does tend to increase, and it's quite noticeable. And beyond that, I'm not sure that I can offer you much in the way of physiological science, because there's just not a lot of clear evidence as to what those fibers are doing. But if you share my general philosophy of life, I think again it's probably not there necessarily for the alleviation of pain. Okay. We will look at illustration of figures and illustrations such as this on multiple occasions. This is just looking at the big picture. I want to make sure that you can put everything into context. Here's the core. By the way, we're looking at the thoracic region here. We're sort of looking at the oblique angle there between the ribs. So you can see the orientation of the vertebra. You can see the spinal column. You can see the spinal nerve here. Here's our sympathetic rami and the paravertebral ganglion. But what I also wanted you to pay attention to, because it's important in this context, is the branching of the somatic rami. So remember, we have the sympathetic rami here, but this is called the anterior ramus of the spinal nerve, and it's the larger. It's by far the much larger. And here's your posterior ramus. And in general, for now, we won't worry about this too much right at the moment. The function of the posterior ramus is to innervate, provide somatic innervation to the intrinsic muscles of the back. Remember, these are the muscles that articulate the back. And we'll talk about these at our conclusion. And also provide cutaneous sensation. They also provide cutaneous sensation for the skin at the surface of the back. And then the ventral ramus performs the same functions, but you can see in a much more extensive and complex fashion for the entire anterolateral thoracic wall. So it basically handles everything from here superficially all the way to the sternum on either side. Now we need to talk a little bit more. I think all of you are familiar with the terminology of the neural structures in the cord at this point. Remember that cord tends to terminate around L1, L2, and it does so at a region called the medullary cone, or the conus medullaris.
Yeah, ventral ramus. Okay.
And that's right here that you can see.
Oh, done.
And so distal to that, inferior to the medullary cone, are the descending spinal roots that in aggregate are called the horse's tail, the cauda equina. So up to this point, I assumed you were talking about me, but in reality, we have another definition for cauda equina. The entire structure here, the entire assemblage of filaments, lies within a dural sac. The dural sac distal to the medullary cone, is called the lumbar cistern. The lumbar cistern. Remember, cistern is just a reliquary or vessel. And then there is a specialized portion of the pia mater. It's very specialized. It really doesn't resemble the pia mater in any other respect. There's some other specializations we'll talk about in just a moment. Extending all the way, it's entirely structured, entirely structural. It has no neural function whatsoever. That extends all the way from the medullary cone down into the coccyx and that's called the terminal filament for the phylum Terminal. And its function is generally thought to lend structural support to the arrangement of these descending. Yeah.
How far down does it extend the dura?
Well, the dura is going to be terminating in the sacrum here at about the second level, second parameter. Remember we talked about the sacral hiatus distal to that. So once again, don't confuse the levels of the column with the levels of the cord. The cord terminates in the proximal lumbar region. So in reality, the cord only occupies about the upper 2/3 of the column. About 17 inches long, depending on the height of the individual, and depending on the region, about the diameter of the thumb. There are enlargements in the cervical and lumbar region we'll talk about with an association and sprouting of the fibers to go to the upper and lower limbs. We've indicated previously that the complexity of the circuits in the spinal cord provide for some degree of motor and sensory autonomy. We talked about, for example, monosynaptic, disynaptic, and trisynaptic reflexes. We've indicated that in other mammals and other vertebrates, there are actually entire ambulatory routines. By that I mean the animal can walk using simply the circuits that are available in the spinal cord. Not so much humans. We seem to depend much more upon higher integrating centers to walk and so on. But my point is, there are many very, very sophisticated reflex circuits present in the cord. And that as a consequence of that, again, going off in my usual digression, let's say you have a spinal patient has a distal transection. Some of the current research would indicate we have no ability now to rejoin the two segments of the spinal cord. But what if you just pretend? What if you create a system whereby the distal cord thinks it's receiving instructions from above? And so a lot of research now is directed or intended to send to the distal cord sequences of action potentials that would resemble those involved in the corticospinal tract. And thus, if the distal cord thinks that those routines are for walking, then it starts walking again. So, by the way, a lot of that is done with light. Field of science called optogenetics. The signals are sent through little fiber optics and cellular mechanisms. We won't get into it here. You can see the transections of the cord here, in the transections of the cord here, the ratio of white matter to gray matter tends to change. It's not quite as, in all cases, not quite as evident as this. But what you'll notice is that as we move from the cervical to the sacral, there's a much greater ratio of white matter to gray matter up top than at the bottom. So in other words, if I said that correctly, but the proportion of gray matter increases as we move south, as we move toward the sacral cord. The proportion of white matter increases as we move to the cervical cord. Why would that be? Again, as a point of engineering, why would you have so much more white matter? Yeah, you just have so much more stuff. You have more wires, kind of like the wiring harness in your car. There are more wires coming through the firewall between the engine. And then you get back to the tail lights, you don't have as many wires, right? Yes.
With the more gray matter in the sacral area, we accommodate the cell lines for neurons innervating the lower extremities.
I think that's part of it. As I say, this is a bit of an oversimplification because you actually have enlargements enlargements of the cord that accommodate just what you're talking about. We're down into the sacral cord here now. I think the better explanation for this, when we get down to the sacral cord, is that you just don't need as many wires to go to various points. We've already, in the lumbar region, we've sent most of our wiring down to the legs. There's some other changes that occur. Notice that especially the dorsal horns tend to thicken as we descend as well. So just be familiar with the terms. I think you know what we mean by for example, in a cadaver specimen such as this, you would be able to differentiate the spinal nerves, for example, from the roots. And you can see this is the dorsal ramus. We talked about the ventral ramus and the dorsal ramus. We could see the transected dorsal ramus indicated by the red arrows there. The dorsal root ganglion, sort of the enlargement or varicosity that you see at the black and the white arrows.
Mhm.
These are the rootlets. Notice at this level, even in the thoracic region, there is a substantial descent of each rootlet before it leaves the cord. We've defined the medullary cone and phylum terminal, so you can see the conus medullaris right there. It sort of terminates, and then in this specimen, that long strand that you see descending from that is the specialized region of pia mater that extends all the way into the coccyx. The yellow highlight here is the caudate echina, the descending fibers distal to or inferior to the medullary cone. We talked about the lumbar cistern in this illustration on the right. The lumbar cistern would be everything in purple that you see there. So that's your dural sac that extends down again about the S2 or so. And then there's the medullary cone there, terminus of it. And then you can see the roots continuing to emerge through the sacral foramina, distal, the dorsal roots posteriorly, the ventral roots anteriorly through the sacral foramina. But this is an important region for you. Why is it an important region for you? You're gonna, huh? It's lumbar, but why? Well, that's true. I guess that was my theme. You're exactly right. Certainly, I think for that reason, you're gonna be. So one thing you might do. I don't know that this is done so much anymore. It's usually done prior to surgeries and so much. It's not usually done for immediate pain relief. But you might need to introduce a block, a nerve block. Why would this region be preferable to some other region of the cord, independent of whatever the procedure is? Why might this region be easier to work with? More,
It's under the way of anything that controls every vital organ.
you were heading in the right direction, and you zigged when I was getting ready to zag. That may or may not be true. I would argue that you've got some vital organs down here, but I thought you were going to tell me that we don't have to worry about poking the cord.
Yeah.
We're down here below the cord, so you have a little more room to work with. But in your procedures, I've got several slides coming up to look at this. You're nevertheless going to have to be very precise with your anatomy, because in some cases you're going right through here, depending upon the procedure. And you can see that could be fraught with potential problems. We mentioned the cervical and lumbar enlargements. These are just transitory increases in the girth of the cord to accommodate innervation of the upper limb and the lower limb. You can see the approximate location of those. And again, we're already familiar with the relationship between the vertebra and the nerves. Now, as we look at this transection, again, quickly tell me, where is this? What region of the column are we looking at here? Cervical. All right, good. We have a lot of clues to tell you that. Here we have a little bit more information to add to our fundamental anatomical knowledge. We can see the transection of the cord. We can see the dorsal and the ventral horns. But I also want you to be able to identify the subarachnoid space. Right? That would be the subarachnoid space in there. Okay. Be able to identify the dura. They made quite a thick dura here. That gray thing is the dura there. And then peripheral or superficial to the dura, what do you notice between the vertebra and the cord or the dura. Yeah, there's going to be extensive epidural fat, especially in certain regions of the cord. Kind of protective encasement. And then you can see the ventral and dorsal. Most people spell dorsal with a D. Sometimes I use a P. Dorsal ramming. And we indicated that the phylum terminal is a specialized region structure of the pia mater. There's some others you should be familiar with, and you kind of see them in these illustrations. You can see them right here. These are called denticulate ligaments. Denticulate as in tooth-like. And their function, again, seems to be structural. The function of the denticulate ligaments is to sort of maintain or ensure the position of the cord within the dural sac, sometimes called the fecal shell, so that it doesn't slosh around, move around inappropriately. It's a sort of a mechanical attachment, ensuring, I would imagine, the appropriate flow, for example, of fluid.
Are those extensions of dura?
No, they're actually technically extensions of the pia that extend out to the dura. And I think that's more of an embryological assignment than anything else. It just means that that tissue is derived from the same tissue that forms the pia.
To look at the spinal cord, we'll divide the dura in the midline. And lay it aside. Here's the spinal cord. In the early embryo, the spinal cord extends the whole length of the vertebral column. But as development progresses, the vertebral column grows much more rapidly than the cord. The cord ends up filling only the upper 2/3 of the vertebral canal. The lower end of the cord, in the adult, is at the level of the first lumbar vertebra. Let's see some more details. These are nerve roots. We'll look at them in a minute. The cord is attached to the dura by a series of fine triangular ligaments, the denticulate ligaments. To see how the spinal nerves arise, we'll go up to the cervical region. The denticulate ligaments have been divided. Each spinal nerve arises from a small bundle of dorsal filaments, which unite to form the dorsal sensory root of the nerve, and a similar bundle of ventral filaments, which unite to form the ventral motor root. In the cervical region, the nerve roots follow a slightly oblique downward course. In the thoracic region, their course becomes more oblique. Here, right at the lower end of the spinal cord, this continuous line of nerve filaments gives rise to a large number of nerve roots, which run vertically downwards, almost hiding the very end of the cord, which is here. Below this point, the dural sac is occupied not by the cord, but by this leash of vertically running lumbar and sacral nerve roots, the cauda equina. The nerve roots leave the vertebral canal, 2 at a time, all the way down to the lower end of the sacrum.
So it really doesn't matter which point we pick, but in a moment we're going to talk about the blood supply to the cord, and we're going to sort of, as usual, oversimplify things. But I just want you to see, you can see the spinal artery, and you can see that it's not linear, that it doesn't follow a simple, narrow, confined path. In reality, it's all over the place. So maybe just remember this as we continue our discussion regarding the blood supply to the cord. Just a moment. So be familiar with the term lumbar cistern. Again, very important for you because so many procedures involve this structure. And then, as we've seen in previous illustrations, be aware of the relationship of those sacral foramina to the emergence of the dorsal and ventral roots, both posterior and anterior. And this is kind of neat. Again, if you haven't seen the Ackland, you can see the relationship, the suspension of the cord within that vertebral canal.
To see the contents of the vertebral canal from end to end, we'll take a look from behind at a dissection in which all the laminae have been divided along these lines and removed.
Again, what we call a laminectomy.
Here's the sacrum. Here's the base of the skull. The tissues that occupy the epidural space have been removed to give us a clear look at the dura. This is the dura. The sleeve of dura is called the dural sac. It's open at the top end and closed at the bottom. Here, at the base of the skull, the dural sac passes through the foramen magnum, becoming continuous with the layer of dura that surrounds the brain.
Remember, there's only one layer of dura.
At the bottom end, within the vertebral canal of the sacrum, the dural sac tapers down to a point at the level of the second sacral segment.
All right, so in a transection, you saw it there. That wasn't quite the one I wanted. He has one where he pokes it side to side, and you can see the intervening structures. But be able to, again, as we pointed out earlier, be able to identify the subarachnoid space, the relationship between the dura and the arachnoid membrane. Remember, both in the brain and in the cord, normally what's happening here is the hydraulic pressure. I guess the more correct term would be the hydrostatic, excuse me. The hydrostatic pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid is pushing the outer arachnoid membrane against the dura mater. So there should be no space between the arachnoid and the dura, but the CSF is filling that trabecular region between the arachnoid and the pia. I've been talking about why this region, this lumbar region, is so useful to you. What we're going to watch now is a spinal tap, the extraction of CSF from this region. And again, why would they use this region? Again, there's less possibility for things to go wrong.
Le voy a subir esta luz aquí un poquito.
Patient could be in a fetal position, or they could be bent over like that, or sitting. See if there's anything you would do different. There's your lumbar kit. I think they're on sale on Amazon today. Might also be thinking, would there be any residual effects for such a procedure in the patient afterward? And why? I'm not sure the lady on the right is observing proper protocol with her jewelry.
It's going to leave a little brown circle on your back for a couple of days. It's going to sting, but that doesn't mean it's a bruise. Are you comfortable?
It's important to be comfortable.
You're great so far.
Notice what he's doing there, he's counting the vertical.
Wow, it's a long needle.
It's the anesthetic, is to bring out the artillery. This part is a little unnerving to me. Here's the 10. And it's just like a maple tree after that.
That's it. Can you see it coming out of the back? Clear like water.
Was that good or bad?
It's in the spot. Now it's dripping. It's playing fluid is beginning to increase.
It's kind of remarkable that it
Sometimes it's still on this side.
drips out like that.
Let gravity do its thing.
So they eventually, I thought they maybe showed us now. The end of the procedure. But, yeah, there might be some residual effects. What are the typical residual effects following a procedure such as that? Yeah, headaches, and that can go on for quite some time, in fact, and there may be dizziness and other symptoms as well. I don't know. I guess it would depend upon whatever they're looking for. But I know in that case, they filled the vial. What was that, about a 5 cc vial or something? Yeah, I agree. I don't know that much would be needed in all cases. So I just want you to be, as we saw something like that, just be familiar with the associated anatomy. We're looking, for example, here at the points of entry for a lumbar spinal puncture. And that could be for a number of reasons, introduction of a block or extraction of fluid. But you were talking about lumbar spinal puncture for spinal anesthesia and for epidural anesthesia. So what's the difference as you look at the illustrations there between spinal and epidural?
Spinal goes into.
All right. In one case, they're going all the way into the lumbar cistern. In the other case, they remain outside the dura, epidural, outside the dura. And it would all depend upon your objectives and needs. This would be much more central. This would be more local. As I mentioned, sometimes you notice the individual there palpating the vertebra. This is a transsacral epidural, and notice where the needle is entering here through the sacral foramen. Of course, this is epidural, so we're not penetrating the sac, which you couldn't hear anyway. But the intention is to anesthetize that particular route.
Is this just a different point of access, or?
Yeah, it would depend upon
Okay.
the procedure, what's going to be, whatever needs to be anesthetized. And, would depend where you introduce the block. When we talk about the lower limb, we'll look at another example of a block. So in the illustration here, you can see, first of all, you can see the gray would be the dura, the purple there would be the arachnoid, and then extending out to the dura would be those denticulate ligaments that we talked about, that are at least nominally extensions of the pia mater. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the blood supply. Remember our discussion of the regional arteries. We don't need to get into this in great detail now, but I hope now that you understand what we mean by a regional or segmental artery, we would call these vertebral, ascending cervical, intercostal, lumbar, or sacral, for example, or iliosacral might be the better term. And you have this anatomy charted over here. I'm not too concerned that you work out the individual anatomical connections here, but be able to use the proper term to describe the regional artery. Again, the regional artery are those paired arteries that come directly off the aorta. All right. Now, we posted these. I hope you have all these pictures of the day. And part of the problem we have here, there are two problems. Number one, the terms that are used to describe these arteries are not consistently observed, especially in the medical literature. So we'll talk about that. And then secondly, two different structures have approximately the same name. So with that warning, let's just work through this. So here's the aorta. Again, you can see the regional or segmental arteries branching off, one on each side. All right. So the large vessel, this would be our regional or segmental artery on each side. Could be lumbar, could be intercostal. And then, because what we want to know, we're trying to work our way to the perfusion of the spinal cord itself. So next, you will see what's called the spinal branch, which is right there, the spinal branch of the segmental artery. And then that spinal branch of the segmental artery in turn branches into two arteries, there are two divisions usually. One is the radicular, radical means root, so that tells you what it does. It follows the neural root. And in the illustration down here on the lower left, this would be the radicular artery that's inferior. Again, radicular implies root. Superior to that is an artery that extends all the way over to this one, which is not called the spinal branch of the segmental artery. It's just called the spinal artery. In this case, it's the anterior spinal artery. So let me make sure we understand the terminology. This superior branch from the spinal branch of the segmental goes all the way over to the spinal artery, which is here. There's one anterior and two posterior usually. That artery that's superior there is usually called the medullary artery, medullary. So radicular down here, medullary up here, that interconnects. The general function of the medullary artery then is to interconnect the spinal arteries and the spinal branch, or the spinal, or it's usually just called the spinal branch of the segmental artery. Now, as I say, the only problem we have in the clinical literature, in the medical literature that you'll be working with, is that sometimes all of this is just called the radicular artery. That's usually what you'll see. Sometimes you'll see the whole thing called the medullary artery. But I guess at least in theory, we should keep these straight. But what you'll notice then is what we're talking about is this connection between the regional artery and the spinal artery proper. Let's look at this one here. We can see our our, one anterior spinal, our paired posterior spinals.
We don't have these pictures.
You don't have this one? I posted it. I'm sorry?
Yeah, we didn't have the small one either.
We don't have the small one.
No, I
right?
told you, I reposted it. I think, does any,
I just got it right now. I don't have it.
well, I reposted it. I don't know. I checked, I did this the other day, so I'll check again. I can't imagine, because I went up back there and checked it myself. But I'll do that again. In any case, I'll make sure that you have these. They'll be up there at the end of the day. But that's difficult to understand. So in this illustration, you can see once again, you can see that it's identical to the other one in terms of the structures. You can see the spinal arteries, two on the back, one in the front, two on the back, one in the front here. And then we're just trying to understand the connection between the spinal arteries and the segmental artery. And in this case, they're calling it medullary. Down here too, see the connection between the spinal branch and the spinal artery is also called, well, here it's called radicular. Usually it's called medullary. So that's what you encounter. You'll see both terms used to describe that connection between the segmental and the spinal. Yeah. Let's go back to this one. So here's your segmental artery, right here. This is the spinal branch of the segmental artery. Spinal branch of the segmental. There is one branch that follows the root, and I'm not sure that it's very clear in here, but we'll call this the radicular, because I don't know that it's denominated here.
On the other side, it shows posterior and anterior.
Okay, good. But does it show? No, it doesn't. But normally, what you see in most of the anatomical literature, not so much the medical, is that this branch that goes from here to here is not the radicular. It's called the medullary. I know it's labeled, but I just want you to be aware of that potential source of confusion. I don't know what to tell you, except that this is what you will see and what you will encounter. So I don't want you to be concerned or upset or surprised if you see this structure called radicular and this structure called medullary, which is what they're showing here. So I went and tried to find a picture where you could see that. And oftentimes, they'll just pick one or the other. Here, they're calling this what? Medullary. Yeah. This junction between the spinal artery and the segmental artery.
And there's a posterior and anterior branch of the
Yes.
medullary or radicular.
Correct.
And
And the only real difference there is that you'll notice there are usually, remember we looked at the Ackland earlier, this is a gross oversimplification, but in general there are two posterior spinal arteries and one anterior spinal artery.
do those spinal arteries anastomose with the posterior medullary?
Do they anastomose? They are continuous with it. Yes, they connect. Yeah, that's yeah. I don't know what else to say except that in both directions, that medullary or radicular artery connects the segmental and the spinal arteries. Technically, I was trying to find a better picture. I'll keep looking. But technically, the radicular artery accompanies the root. The medullary artery is usually larger and interconnects the segmental and the spinal. Aside from that, here's the anterior spinal, by the way, of transection. That's very frustrating because I bet I spent a half hour reposting these to make darn sure that you had them before we got to this material, and I went up on the site and checked several times, so I don't know what to do. All right. But just remember, in terms of anatomical etymology, their origin of the term, that the radicular artery is called the radicular because it's going to accompany the root. And there's several smaller branches of this we need not worry about. We talked about the regional arteries and the in the thoracic region, these would be called the intercostal. We'll look at those more extensively when we address that topic. We've talked about the spinal veins. The veins, remember, the problem with the veins is that they really, in that vertebral canal, form those complex venous plexuses. So that when we try to ascribe a certain number to them, it's not very productive. But you had an illustration earlier showing the anterior, posterior, and vertebral venous plexuses for drainage of the canal. This is sort of an artistic rendering, but this is toward the brain. But you can sort of see the anfractus, the tortuous route of these posterior spinal veins. We used the term laminectomy before. Just remember when we talk about a laminectomy, it could be removal of all three processes at the pedicle, or it could just be removal of the spinous process. And the whole purpose of these would be to afford access to the vertebral canal. I think I struggled with the pronunciation of this term. I checked into it. The proper clinical pronunciation, anybody know it? Anyone give that one a try? I think I mispronounced it when I did it before. You came closer than I have always been. I normally say spondylolisthesis. That's what I've been saying. But I think the technically correct pronunciation is spondylolisthesis, according to the medical dictionary that I consulted. And what we're talking about here is a relative dislocation, as you can see in this case, of L5 relative to S1. And that can entail significant consequences, or as you often read when you see, it seems this would be invariably irreversible with respect to the damage, but in some cases you'll see gradual recovery of the patient following the dislocation. We've talked about a herniation. Again, I want you to think about the consequences for the structures passing through the intervertebral foramen and the location of the nociceptors and the meninges. Of course, be thinking about the positions of all those ligaments. Because next time you can see a herniation here in a radiograph, you can see a herniation here. We're going to look at a little video. In fact, that's where we'll leave off today. Then we'll come back next time and watch a procedure whereby they are accessing that tissue. Now, then today, this concludes the material for your test. And I think next week, because we don't have class Friday, right, as you want to. So I think next week you'll have to remind me. Aren't we scheduled for the afternoon on the 6th? I think it's 1 to 4 or something. So be aware of that. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow for the physiology. Oh, yes, thank you. I told you. Just a few moments.